Angie's List is now Angi, and they've made it easier than ever to get all your home projects done right. We all know how busy our lives are, and we just don't have time to schedule somebody to come fix something or do some project we need to have done. And frankly, what happens is it just doesn't get done. Thankfully, we have Angi that can help you get the projects done that you need to get done professionally and done well. Angi has over 20 years of home service experience, and they've combined it with new tools to simplify the whole process. Just bring them your project online or with the Angi app, answer a few questions, and Angi can handle the rest from start to finish. Or help you see ratings and reviews, compare quotes from local pros, and connect instantly. Which means you can cross things off your to-do list in just a few taps, because whether it's routine maintenance or a dream remodel, Angi is here to make it easy. So get your next project done with the help of a pro from Angi. Download the free Angi mobile app today or visit Angi.com. That's ANGI.com, Angi.com.
I am Lola Blanc.
And I'm Megan Elizabeth.
And we're the hosts of Trust Me, the podcast about cults, extreme belief, and the abuse of power.
Now on podcast 1.
We want to debunk the myth that people who join cults are uneducated, because anyone can be manipulated by a narcissist.
And we should know we both have been.
Join us every week as we explore the world of extreme belief,
talk to survivors and experts,
and share our own experiences with cults and the abuse of power. Get new episodes of Trust Me every Wednesday on Podcast 1 and anywhere you get your podcasts.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we begin our deep dive into the Murdaugh trial. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my mystifying co-host, Aliki.
I didn't know what you'd go with in pronouncing my name, because I was like, you've kind of run out of options at this point. But you have exceeded all expectation yet again, Brett.
That's what I try and do, Alice. I always want to exceed your expectations in everything we do.
Oh, you are a mystifying wonder.
I mean, the true mystery is how to pronounce Alec Murdaugh's name.
That is the true mystery. But it actually is very fitting, because it seems like there's only one way to pronounce Alice. As you may think Alex, there's only one way to pronounce it. But there are so many ways to pronounce Alec. Alice.
Like,
Alec.
people keep writing in that it's Alec, but people there call him Alec.
Alec.
And I realize they are trying to say Alec because that's just their, no offense, weird low country accent.
But why the C when it's an X?
I don't know. I think it's kind of like Alec Baldwin. That's just what he goes by.
But it's spelled A-L-E-C.
I know, which is weird. Or A-L-E-X is how he spells it. But when you listen to 911 call, which we're going to do eventually, he says Alec. I think.
Huh.
We'll have to listen to that again.
We'll have to, we're listening to the 911 call purely to see how he pronounces his own name.
Exactly. And I'm not sure that he's always consistent with it, so.
He's not. Even with his last name, he's not consistent. Anyways, we better get this recorded before this baby comes.
5 episodes on this, but that's right. It's been a full day since the last time we recorded, so Alice has not had the baby in the meantime.
Not in the last, we recorded about 12 hours ago. This has not been that much time, but we are recording around the clock because I really want to get this trial done. It would be a little disjointed, at least for me. You remember everything, but if we had to take a break and even a couple of weeks before I came back and finished, the episodes.
It's not going to happen, Alice. I'm bringing the portable mic to the hospital. If we have to do a hospital recording, we're going to do it. Maybe in the midst of labor, There you go. Patreon Live, labor recording of Alec Murdaugh Part 6.
And maybe subtext, more than you bargained for.
The TMI episode.
The TMI episode, indeed. With that, okay, this trial.
This is part 5.
This is
and we're
part
finally
5.
to the trial.
It
only took us 4 parts to get to the trial.
Well, no, in our defense, we talked about the timeline up to the trial, but there's so much to discuss, and obviously a lot comes out during the trial. A lot came out before the trial just because this case was so well covered, and it was fascinating as things were being uncovered even before charges were brought. But this trial is like a circus in and of itself, as all trials are, by the way. You should just know that, guys. Trials are always fun. Well, I guess fun for some people, terrifying for others. If you have the litigator personality, it's really fun because you cannot perfectly script out a trial, and that's what's happened here.
It's really interesting. Total aside, but most lawyers that if you know lawyers, they may not even try cases. I don't know what the percentage is of people who try cases for a living, lawyers because a lot of times it's funny, if you work at a big law firm and you're a quote unquote litigator at a big law firm, your trial experience will be you pick up a pro bono case where you're representing an indigent defendant in a gun possession case or something. And that's literally the only trial you ever have because there's just not very many trials. So I think the percentage of lawyers who actually get to have a trial and experience that is probably a lot lower than you would think. Even when we were, and I still am, working as prosecutors, there weren't as many trials as maybe you would expect. A lot of times people plead guilty or it goes away for whatever reason. So trials are great and they're awesome and they are increasingly rare in the court system. So it's always fun when we have this opportunity. We've got these 2 big other trials hanging out there that everybody's looking forward to, Delphi and the Idaho murders. I think there's a good chance at least one of those doesn't go to trial. Now, maybe both of them will, but we'll just have to see. Doesn't happen that often, so enjoy this one. This one's been a roller coaster ride, and we're finally really getting into it. We're going to walk through the evidence that was presented at trial. We are not going to do it necessarily in the order in which it was presented by the prosecution. Just as you guys who listen to it, they have to do things in a certain way to introduce evidence. And I think what they're trying to do, and the reason it may seem disjointed at times, is they are trying to mix in interesting witnesses with the boring ones. So that's why there's not a block of cell phone evidence. It'll be like a guy who's boring about cell phones for a while, and then an interesting witness who knows the Murdaughs. And I think that's what they were trying to do. That's a tactical decision when you're in the moment. Not going to criticize them for that. The trial has been slow at times. It has seemed disjointed at times. The prosecution has now rested, as we talked about in the last episode, and I really feel like they brought it all together by the end. So I think they did a good job, but we're not necessarily going to go in exactly the order they went in, though we are going to start pretty much where they started, because every trial generally is going to start with the incident itself. A trial like this, a violent crime trial like this, is going to start with the incident itself. And that's what they did here. And they called Daniel Green, who's a Colleton County Sheriff Sergeant, and he is the guy who responded to the 911 call. He's going to be the officer who's the first on the scene, he's seeing things for the first time. He's not going to be a detective. He's an ordinary officer. He has some training in how to maintain a scene, but he's not going to lead this investigation going forward. But because he's the first guy on the scene, he's always going to be an important witness, and you're always going to see someone like him very early on. So he shows up. He goes to the scene. Alec Murdaugh, he's down at the kennels. He meets him. He's got his shotgun that he got from his house, and he sort of directs him to where the bodies are. He goes and looks at the bodies, and he knows. These people are dead. There's no question that they're dead. We always give people like Alec Murdaugh a lot of leeway when we talk about them because family members can often hope for the impossible, even when it's clearly impossible, and even when someone's been dead for quite some time. But this officer, he's under no such illusions. He sees blood. He sees brain matter. In fact, he sees Paul's brain. Paul's brain, the defense attorneys have been very visceral in describing it as blown out of the back of his head. People have wondered why they did that. And my theory, as I've said before, is that they really want to emphasize how brutal this was to say, no way a father would do this. I think at one point, one of the technicians says that they actually took his brain to the autopsy in a bucket. So that's the kind of, that's the brutality you've got here. And so there's no question, he's dead. The officer goes to see Maggie. She is very clearly dead in a pool of blood and 2 obvious gunshots to her head. She's dead. And Officer Green, Murdaugh asks him, are they dead? And he tells them, yes, they are dead. And Murdaugh very early on offers to him that he thinks the murders are related to the boat case, the thing we've talked about, the boating accident his son had been involved in when someone died. And he says this very early. Is this strange? Is it not? We've talked about controlling the narrative before and how oftentimes people who are involved in crimes like this will attempt to control the narrative. This appears, if you believe he's guilty, it's kind of funny. So much evidence, it doesn't actually prove anything. It's just, if they're guilty, it supports your conclusion. I feel like this is one of those things. If he's guilty, then he's trying to control the narrative. If he's not guilty, then you could imagine he's been there for minutes trying to think, why would anyone do this to my family? And this is the first thing that comes to mind. And he wants to make sure the officer knows that immediately because he wants to find who did it. And so he's racking his brain. Why would anyone do this? And this is what he comes to. And so he tells the officer. That's the charitable view. I think most people view this as strange. Nevertheless, Green also describes him as upset but not crying. And you see this with Murdaugh a lot. And people have commented on this, that he often seems very emotional, but he doesn't actually seem like he's crying. Now, he has cried some. But there are a lot of times, both on the video and in court, where he's very upset, but he's not crying. And this is something the officer notices. And the officer would be trained when he comes into a scene like this and there's someone who's there to be observing this kind of thing. Because Murdaugh is immediately a suspect, obviously. There's no question about that. And so he's observing him and he's observing this kind of stuff. And he tells him when he found the scene, he'd gone up to the residence and grabbed the shotgun, which he has for his own protection. This shotgun is introduced into evidence. It is a 12-gauge camouflage Benelli Super Black Eagle. The Murdaughs were fans of the Super Black Eagle. It's no surprise given how much they hunt. This is a very nice shotgun. It's about a $2,000 shotgun, which is a very expensive shotgun. You can buy a Remington pump-action shotgun, which is something I own, for like $100. So when you're spending $2,000 on a shotgun, you're getting a really nice gun, and that's what he has. Now, the officer, he has his body camera on, so you're seeing this. In the trial, they're cutting back and forth because some of the body camera is obviously very sensitive. It's showing the bodies, but the jury's seeing everything. They're seeing this body camera, and they're seeing these interactions. The one thing the officer notices that the prosecution comes back to again and again is that there's a lot of water around Paul's body. Now, it had not been raining enough to cause that water, and it's sort of a mystery about why this water is there. There's going to be another witness who's going to testify later who says that they would wash out the kennels, but not there, that the water's in a weird place. I have no explanation for this, and the prosecution hasn't offered an explanation for this. I don't know if in closing they're going to come back to this water and tell some story with it, but it's something he points out. So the officer, he does ask Murdaugh about the shotgun. This is the point where he says, well, I was worried. I don't think this is random. My son's been getting death threats because of this boating accident. And he knew, Murdaugh really believed that that's what this was about, that this was somehow related to that. He says that he gives the story. This is the first time where he lays out the story. We talked about this last time. We went through the timeline about how this is the moment where he's going to tell the story for the first time. And the story he tells for the first time is going to remain pretty consistent and in some ways may sink him. He says he went to check on his parents. He sort of explains that his parents have been sick and he wanted to make sure they were okay. He doesn't go into all the details, but he gives enough. And he says, if the officer checks his phone, he'll be able to confirm the exact time he left. This is another thing some people think is strange because, once again, it seems like he's already creating the narrative. He's already creating his alibi. He's a lawyer. And that colors a lot of this and the way I look at it. I just feel like lawyers in the situation, particularly one who's worked as a prosecutor, might think about all this differently. He obviously would know that he's going to be a suspect immediately and just assume for a second he's innocent. The thing he wants to do is clear himself immediately so that the police use all their resources looking for who did it. So I don't know. Like I said, this is something that people have thought was strange and incriminating. Is it? I'm not sure. This goes back to my feeling about behavior and behavioral analysis. I know a lot of you guys love it. I know you love it. You're always telling me I need to watch videos of people analyzing behavior. And frankly, I never do because I don't buy a lot of that stuff. And I just feel like all of it cuts one of two ways. And usually they're diametrically opposed. It's incriminating or it's not incriminating. So I prefer to stick to evidence, which is not to say that behavior is never interesting. We talk about it all the time. But stuff like this, I just don't know. I know some of you find it powerful. To me, not necessarily.
And here's the thing with us, like, I agree with you. I don't like to dabble in it, partly because I know I'm not trained in that. And so I can be swayed either way, but I know what I am trained in, which is looking at the evidence and making legal and factual arguments. So I try to stick to that just because, guys, every behavioral video I've seen about Murdaugh, I'm like, yeah, that sounds like it's plausible. But then I can easily flip it in my head and just have the exact same analysis, but have the conclusion be the opposite. And that's why he's blank, guilty or innocent. So part of it isn't that we don't like it. It's that we're not trained in that. And so I don't think we can bring any value to behavioral analysis.
And let me also say this. Every interaction I've seen with Alec Murdaugh, he strikes me as a strange guy. But he just strikes me as strange. I don't see in him... He's not the kind of person I often interact with. He doesn't act the way I would expect him to act. And the fact that he's kind of a strange guy, kind of a weird guy, kind of quirky, is another reason that it's just hard for me to assume that, well, this seems a little out of the ordinary, so therefore he must be guilty. Maybe that's what it means. I'm not telling you not to believe that, but just I'm giving you the other side of this, because up to this point, the only side of it you've heard is this clearly shows he's guilty. Now, he asked multiple times if they're dead. He asked it many, many times. Honestly, when he's asking it, he doesn't seem, and here I go, falling into the trap. He doesn't seem as distraught as maybe you would expect him to seem. He's kind of asking it, and it's
almost like matter of fact. Like,
exactly.
It was almost like he didn't hear the answer the first time. Like, are they dead? You know, it's almost in that tone rather than, you know, you all have probably heard a lot of 911 calls where it's like heaving or like a parent drops to the floor when they hear that their child is dead. You know, that they may even expect it. Let's say a child is missing at like a lake and it's not out of the ordinary that that child may have drowned. And when the police finally find them and they hear those words, they fall to their knees. I mean, we've seen this before. You've probably heard it on 911 calls. And not to say that everyone reacts that way, because we've already heard Alec is just kind of I agree, he's a little bit of a strange bird. He kind of has strange mannerisms that I'm just not used to, but he doesn't even act in a way where he's heard the answer. It's almost like he just repeats it. Are they dead? You sure? Are they really dead? Almost as if he were asking what the weather was in a way.
And it is funny, when you watch enough body cam videos, you really do see the full spectrum of people's reactions to things. And Alice and I had sort of a weird practice in our prosecuting business where on the one hand, we're doing a lot of financial crimes and crimes that aren't that visceral, but we also did a lot of violent crime stuff. And a lot of times you would see body cam videos of police officers telling people something that had happened. And they really do. It's the full gamut of reactions, from the sort of wailing, collapsing to the ground, to more matter-of-fact stuff. And Murdaugh is sort of kind of a weird combination of two. And I'll give you an example of one of the weird things that happens that the prosecution points out at a very early, this is very early on, this is the first day of witnesses. They're showing this video, and when you show a video, what you want to do as the prosecutor or the defense attorney, any attorney, you don't just put the video on and then sit down and let it run. There are times where you want to stop it. And you want to ask the officer questions about it. And the defense always objects because they're like, he's just asking him to repeat what he just saw. But okay, you get to give context. And this is an example when that happens. At this point, other officers are arriving on the scene. And Murdaugh, he's telling the officer details about finding the bodies of his dead son and dead wife. And someone walks behind the officer, and Murdaugh, in the middle of telling the story of finding the bodies of his dead family, pauses and says, "How you doing?" in the most like nonchalant way possible to this person walking by, and then just continues with the story. And it's frankly very weird. It's one of those things that is just a strange thing. And the prosecution, they actually stop at this point and rewind it and play it again. and get the officer to explain the circumstances around it, because it is so strange. And it does not seem like the kind of thing you would expect from someone who is shocked and surprised and devastated to have just found his family members dead. And on the video, Murdaugh, he's clearly upset. He's breathing heavily. He's not panicking. He's not catatonic. Like Al said, he's not falling to the ground, weeping. But, you know, he also isn't covered in blood, which is something the defense attorneys are going to point to as a reason to think he had not just killed these two people.
Interestingly, one of the first things the officer tells another officer when he arrives on the scene is that one of the victims was Paul Murdaugh, who had been involved in, quote, that boat wreck. And that's exactly how he says it, as if, like, I don't know, that would tell you who it is. And apparently, Alec wasn't the only one who thought that was immediately significant. I mean, the boat wreck really was, you know, a big part of the local news, and I think people had been watching it, and it had to do with the Murdaugh family. So I think this puts it into perspective that he may not be the only one thinking about the boat wreck, and also it is well known enough that maybe it is front of mind for people. During cross-examination...
It is an interesting point that this officer sort of immediately knows the context. Clearly, this is a famous thing in the county.
Right. But that he can say boat wreck, and that would mean anything, because obviously when you come on a scene, you're trying to convey information to the next police officer so that they're not starting over in the investigation, right? You kind of try to catch them up to speed really quickly. And so your words kind of matter, and you don't want to waste a bunch of words on, like, gossip's not the right word, but just like, oh, isn't this interesting? So the fact that boat wreck in and of itself, which is a pretty generic term, not Mallory Beach boat wreck, not that lawsuit involving the boat wreck, just literally boat wreck, was all this officer needed to be able to get caught up to speed when typically you are giving, like, the bullet point stats of a scene you're walking into. And that's usually something like gunshot wound, 2 victims, 1 male, 1 female family members. That's typically, you know, when you watch TV Law and Order, that's typically what they do. And here include boat wreck. So maybe, and that's why behavioral analysis is a little bit fraught in this case, because this is not your typical case. And the fact that Alec would bring up the boat wreck may not actually be that strange. Cross-examination of this officer actually starts with water, the water we talked about previously. The defense suggests that the water was inside and outside of those dog kennels, and that it's possible the water was actually used to wash out the pens to clean them. Now, I guess the water is significant because a random attacker probably wouldn't try to clean up for any reason, but Murdaugh might. I'm not exactly sure where this goes. It's an interesting tactic to start your cross-examination as the defense with the water, but I guess it can cause enough confusion that you kind of throw the jury off the scent of what this officer had to say, which is, this officer said multiple times, you know, he didn't cry, maybe wasn't as upset as the officer would expect him to be. So maybe he's trying to, I don't know, confuse the situation. Personally, I think the water issue is probably a red herring either way, whether Alec did it or not. I don't know why water's around Paul's body. I mean, maybe it's something as simple as there was a bucket of water and he tripped over it as he was being shot. I don't know. But it seems like Alec probably wouldn't have time to clean up. And what would he clean up around a body? Like the gunshot wound is what killed him. So there's unlikely to be a lot of, I don't know, evidence that would point to Alec around him that could be washed away with water. So all to say is, even though the defense started cross-examination there, I actually think it probably doesn't have a huge role to play in the committing of the crime. Remember, we noted earlier that Alex said after he saw the bodies of his family members, he ran and got a shotgun, right? And the defense actually notes that Alec did load that shotgun, but it was a 12-gauge shotgun, and he loaded it with 16-gauge shells, which they note that you can't fire a 16-gauge shell in a 12-gauge shotgun because they don't match up and it'll jam. And obviously, Alec owns a lot of very nice guns. He owns this hunting lodge, in fact, and their family owns many, many types of guns, a lot of ammunition. And he is certainly not naive around guns. He understands guns, right? Their point is, for someone who understands guns so well, the reason he loaded his 12 gauge shotgun with a 16 gauge shell is that he was so distraught. He was completely out of his mind. You know, kind of like we were saying, we expect people to drop to their knees when they find out their family members have been killed. This is his version of dropping on his knees, something he could do in his sleep. He messes up in his heightened, distraught state at just having found his wife and son killed, is load a 16 gauge shell and a 12 gauge shotgun. So here's a point of fact. You can fire a 16 gauge shell from a 12 gauge shotgun, but only once. Because what happens is the shell will go down the barrel and then get stuck because it's too big. And if you fire another shot after that and the barrel is obstructed, the gun will actually, well, it can blow up. So it's really dangerous. So you'll pull it, you can hear it go through, but it doesn't go all the way through and then stops within the barrel. So the next shot that you fire could cause it to blow up. So the point the defense is trying to make with all of this is that Alec is just so upset. He loaded the wrong shell. He would never do something like this. It ruins your gun. It's dangerous. It's completely ineffective against a killer, right? Like, the point of loading your gun is that in case the killer comes back, you can arm yourself. He's not even thinking straight. He can't do that right because he is so emotional about the shock surrounding the death of his family members.
I don't actually know what you use 16 gauge for. Like I've shot 12.
That's a really big shell.
It's actually small. It's smaller than 12. 12's bigger. That's weird. Like
no, you're right. You're right.
It gets bigger, but yeah, I mean, I don't know where you got these 16 gauge shells, but if you put a 16 gauge in a 20, like Alice said, that can be, or a 12, that can be a problem. And I mean, I don't know.
Doesn't that ruin your gun? Like, I know there's a way to fix it, but not immediately. Like, it's not like you take the gun apart right then as the killer's coming for you to clear the barrel.
The problem is, like, your barrel is basically plugged at that point because you shoot the shotgun. It's not like a bullet. A standard bullet, there's a bullet, so there's one piece of metal, and it's in the round, and then there's the gunpowder, and when you shoot it, the gunpowder explodes, and that one round goes out. Now, you can have 12-gauge slugs, which is like that. It's just a bullet in a shotgun shell. But usually shotgun shells are filled with pellets, and the pellets are supposed to go out the barrel, and the shell, what's left of it, the cartridge, or whatever you want to call it, gets expended out of the shotgun. But in this case, the cartridge can actually travel down the shotgun, and then it gets stuck, like Alice was saying, and that's a big problem, because if you shoot it again, you got a jammed barrel and a shot trying to go down it. It can be very dangerous. That's not something you want to do. So, I don't know. I actually kind of found this to be sort of compelling by the defense. I mean,
it is compelling when you see, like, how, I mean, again, this man has, like, closet full of, like, really nice guns. And when you have really nice guns, like, you spend a lot of time getting to know them. You go to gun shows. You know, it's a hobby. It's not just for protection hunting is a hobby. They even have a hunting lodge, so this is a man who not only has a lot of guns, but a lot of guns come onto his property because people bring their own guns and they compare them and, shop around and enjoy talking about their guns. So he is certainly not, naive about this.
Yeah, and this is one of the first things you learn when you shoot shotguns is that you never, and I don't even know, I'm not sure why they fit, but, you can do it. You can load one and you pull the trigger, it's going to fire. And once again, that's fine, but the next shot is going to be really dangerous for you and not the thing you're aiming at. So yeah, he absolutely would have known about this. And this might be the kind of thing that only people who really know guns would even feel the impact of. This is a rural South Carolina jury. I'm going to bet every one of them, if not most of them, have either fired a gun or know someone who does. This is not obscure knowledge for them. So they would feel the impact of that. And like Alice was saying, this is a guy who knows guns very well. And this is a mistake that's so basic, it almost feels like the kind of mistake you would make when you're in total shock. And what's the point of this? There are a lot of things that Alec did that are weird. We talked about the whole how you doing thing he says to somebody. Later on, the prosecution's going to point to him reading a text message a group text message that basically was a picture of an attractive woman. And at some point, he searches for a restaurant on the beach. And why would you be doing this right after your wife and your kid were killed? I think that's what the defense is going for here, is because he's not thinking clearly. Nothing he does is going to make sense because he's not thinking clearly. And this is a concrete example of that. So I'm curious to know whether this is something they really kind of hammer on as their presentation of the evidence continues.
And it might be insofar as it's just confusing, right? It's not necessarily guilty behavior. It's totally just confusing behavior. And if you don't have a great story to tell, and I don't know, we'll see how the defense goes because they haven't started yet at the time of recording. Confusion is a really good tactic as the defense. Just, there's enough questions here. He doesn't seem to be this sniper-like killer, so maybe he didn't do it, is a tactic we see often.
Guys, you have heard us sing the praises of Prose before, and we were back to do it again. It is the world's most personalized hair care. Switching to a custom routine from Prose is one of the best things that you can do for your hair. And I can tell you, my wife, she has curly red hair. It can be hard for her to find the kind of hair care products that she needs that work for her. And that's why Prose and its in-depth hair quiz is so unique. By analyzing over 85 personal factors, Prose handpicks clean ingredients that get you closer to your hair goals with every wash. My favorite feature is Prose's Review and Refine tool, which lets you tweak your formulas for any reason in case you decide to change up your address, your hair color, or even your diet, and those things can affect your hair. If you're not 100% positive Prose is the best hair care you've had, they will take the products back, no questions asked. So what are you waiting for? Prose is the healthy hair regimen with your name all over it. Take their free in-depth hair consultation and get 15% off your first order today. Go to prose.com/prosecute. That's prose, prose.com/prosecute for your free in-depth hair consultation and 15% off. We're back today to talk about Native, one of our favorite products. Guys, I know this is hard to believe, but I'm a sensitive soul and I have sensitive skin as well. And not every deodorant works for me. A lot of them, they're rough on my skin and they cause a lot of discomfort. And that's one reason I really like Native. Native is a thoughtfully formulated product that keeps you feeling and smelling fresh all day. You may know Native for their aluminum-free deodorant, and they keep their ingredients list bare naked with ingredients you understand like coconut oil, shea butter, and baking soda. It checks a lot of boxes. You got 72-hour odor protection, naturally derived ingredients, and a smooth, residue-free application. I'm a big fan of a lot of their different products. I really like the warm cider and cinnamon. It reminds me of home, and you're going to love it too. Now is the time to make the switch from an antiperspirant to Native. When you visit their site, you can discover all their fresh scents and maybe even try one of their body washes out as well. So smell and feel fresh all day long with Native. Get 20% off your first order by going to nativedeo.com/prosecutors or use promo code prosecutors at checkout. That's nativedeo.com/prosecutors or use promo code prosecutors at checkout for 20% off your first order. You know, I don't know if there's much worse than those massive plastic jugs that laundry detergent comes in. They're heavy, they're awkward, they leak everywhere, and they're 90% water. So why do you need those jugs? Washing machines already use water. Why should you pay more for it? Not to mention, 91% of those jugs don't get recycled. That's right, 700 million detergent jugs wind up in our landfills every single year, and that's where Earth Breeze comes in. New Earth Breeze laundry detergent Eco Sheets. They look like dryer sheets, but they're not. They dissolve 100% in any wash cycle, hot or cold. It couldn't be easier. No measuring or mess. You just take one and toss them in. And the packaging is also compact, biodegradable, and plastic-free. It is completely different from those massive plastic jugs you're used to. And with their Buy One, Give 10 initiative, each purchase donates 10 loads of detergent to a charitable cause of your choice. A whopping 30 million loads have already been donated. Those little sheets have turned a chore into an act of kindness. And most importantly of all, you get a powerful clean for your clothes. I love Earth Breeze. I've loved changing over to them. I've loved getting rid of those massive jugs of messy goo, and you're going to love it too. If you don't like it, Earth Breeze will give you a full refund. You don't even have to send it back. They are that confident you'll love their product as much as I do. Now's the time to try Earth Breeze, because right now, our listeners can subscribe and save 40%. That's right, 40% if you go to earthbreeze.com/prosecutors to get started. That's earthbreeze.com/prosecutors for 40% off. earthbreeze.com/prosecutors. Guys, we have talked about ButcherBox before, and let me tell you, there is no better time than now to get on the ButcherBox train. I know when you think about premium meals, when you're thinking of high quality meats, what are you thinking? Especially right now, you're thinking high prices. You're thinking it's not affordable. You're thinking, man, how am I ever going to be able to feed my family high quality food? And that's where ButcherBox comes in. You can easily find high quality meat and seafood you can trust. It's 100% grass-fed beef, free-range organic chicken, pork-raised, crate-free, and wild-caught seafood. And best of all, you can get this high-quality meat at a convenient low price. There is free shipping to you always, and is delivered right to your doorstep and curated in customized box plans. You can get exclusive member deals and recipe inspiration, and you're gonna save money at the same time. Right now, if you sign up, you get free chicken nuggets for a year. You can't beat that. Free chicken nuggets for a year. And if that wasn't enough, 10% off your first box when you sign up today. That's a 22-ounce bag of gluten-free chicken nuggets in every order for a year when you sign up at butcherbox.com/prosecute and use code prosecute. So fight inflation and claim this deal at butcherbox.com/prosecute and use code prosecute. The next thing the defense is going to do is something that you hear in every defense case, every innocence case, every case challenging the guilt of the accused that you ever see. And that's crime scene integrity and the fact that the police didn't do enough to protect the crime scene. And they do this even when the police did a great job, because some number of people have to enter that crime scene and they are going to do damage to it. The sort of iron law of crime scenes is the more people in, every person who goes in is going to leave something or take something with them. And there's just no getting around that. That's the whole reason you want to secure the crime scene, because you assume the murderer has done that very thing. And the defense is always going to point out the fact that too many people were let in. That was certainly the case here. This is another instance of Murdaugh privilege where people, his friends and family members and everybody else who showed up were in that crime scene when they shouldn't have been, and a lot of officers were as well. And the defense is going to start hammering on that here with this very first witness. First thing they do is they ask about tire tracks. The defense theory is someone else did this. Remember, and this is an important thing to think about in this case, a lot of the cases that Alice and I prosecute, the first thing you have to do is prove there was a crime. So imagine a bank fraud case. Money gets moved around for all sorts of reasons. Money goes into various accounts for all sorts of reasons. They're not necessarily illegal. So the first thing you have to show is that the transactions themselves were illegal. And then you have to prove that the defendant knew about those transactions or authorized those transactions or conspired with someone to make them happen. The first thing you have to show is there's actually a crime here. There actually was a fraud. There actually was a theft. Here you have what some people have called the fact of a body. You have dead bodies. There's been a crime. It wasn't a murder-suicide. That's obvious from the beginning. So, therefore, someone committed this crime. And if it wasn't Alec Murdaugh, who was it? And if there's no way someone else could do it, that's evidence he did it. Talked about this with Scott Peterson. Like, the fact that it's so hard to imagine anyone else committing that crime is evidence against Scott Peterson. Same thing here, and the defense is going to immediately start pushing on that. So they say, hey, tire tracks. Any evidence of anybody else there? And this officer says there were multiple tire tracks going into the scene. So the defense says, well, did you take pictures of those tire tracks? The answer is no, he did not. They ask if he told anyone about those tire tracks. The answer is no, he didn't do that. And he says the reason he didn't take pictures and the reason he didn't point it out to anybody is it wasn't his job. He's first on the scene. It's not his job to do that, which may very well be true.
It's not a great answer when you're the police.
Exactly. It's not a great, because someone needs to do that, and you're the first guy on the scene. So if you see something significant, remember, what's he doing? He told people he didn't see blood on Alec Murdaugh. That's something he mentioned to people. Like, he thought about the things and noticed the things and related the things that went to Murdaugh's guilt. But the things that might have pointed to someone else, that's not my job. That's a problem, and that's something you're going to see the defense continue to push on. He also says that one of the fire and rescue people there noted there were some footprints. He's asked, did you take a picture of the footprints? He did not. He's asked, did you tell the SLED investigators, so the state investigators who were in charge of this case, who end up taking over the case, who are the main guys, they're like the FBI of South Carolina. He didn't mention it to them. And look, they're great investigators, but rather than just hope they also see the thing that the fire and rescue saw, maybe you could have pointed it out to them. And the defense attorney says, weren't there police everywhere? And they were. He asked, were they wearing protective gear on their feet? Did they bag their feet, basically, which is something that the SLED investigators most likely would have done. They did not. He also notes that officers are walking around the areas where the shooting would have occurred. And when they're doing that, they are, with every footstep, potentially destroying evidence of the shooter. And this is the kind of attack that you're often going to see on police witnesses, and it is one that the defense is going to continue. There's another officer who testifies, Melinda Worley, who is an investigator who works for SLED, and the defense uses her to undermine the integrity of the crime scene by pointing out how many people were in that scene. They point out a footprint that a picture was taken of. Well, that was actually made by an investigator. This is typical defense stuff, and it can be indicative of problems, but a lot of times it's defense fluff too. It's always powerful. It can affect juries. It'll affect lay people. You see people talking about this. In fact, as we said in the last episode, the defense actually penned an op-ed making all these same points for the Washington Post. So this is an attack they're going to make. Obviously, the scene has to be entered. It has to be processed. And as long as the things like the footprint are marked and acknowledged, it's usually not that big of a deal. The fact that the police identified that footprint and knew it was from an officer is actually a good thing. Remember the JonBenet Ramsey case. There were multiple pieces of evidence, including a footprint, that could never be conclusively tied to the killer because there were officers wearing the same shoe wear, and the police did not do a good job of eliminating those officers. Here, at least, they've done that. Still, it is an effective attack, and it's something that by the time you hear this, you will have seen, because the defense, who will really start in their case when we're recording next week, they're going to hammer on this.
And that's a great point, Brett. You know, the defense's job, though oftentimes the defense will try to tell a story, is to poke holes. And so think about, you know, which job is harder. It's a lot easier to look at a picture and point out all the things wrong with it than to probably paint it in the first instance, right? And that's kind of what the defense is doing here. He knows there's no pictures of tire tracks because he never received it, right? So it's kind of a great question, because let's just assume that there were pictures and he never received it. Boom. There is like a failure to turn over evidence and, Your Honor, we need a mistrial sort of situation. So they know what is in their case file, and they know that they don't have pictures of tire tracks. So they can ask that question, because even if there are so many other things that the police have done right, the defense, as long as they're pointing out things that weren't done, and by the way, there's an infinity number of things you can do at a crime scene, but to kind of even just outline a few things and then hammer it into the jurors' heads like, well, then that must have been a failure on your part, or there's a crime scene spoliation issue because you didn't do X, Y, and Z. When maybe in the grand scheme of things, X, Y, and Z are not that important. Brett and I have spoken about this a lot with our gun cases. Almost without a fail, the defense is going to ask on cross-examination our police officers why a gun possession case doesn't have fingerprints. Why didn't you send the gun off for fingerprints? We've explained this to you that the way guns are like molded, it's really hard to get a usable fingerprint off of them. Let's say the gun came out of the defendant's waistband. Do you really need fingerprints? It literally fell out of his pants. You're probably not going to get usable prints off of it. It's expensive and it takes a really long time to get fingerprint analysis back. And so it is a reasonable position for the police to look at the totality of the evidence against that, gun possession case and decide not to send off for fingerprints. But you bet your bottom dollar, a great tactic the defense always harps on is, well, you didn't even send it off for prints, did you? What sloppy police work. I'm not saying that's what the defense has done here, but just know that because they ask about it doesn't always mean that it should have been something that was done, or it shows that there's been some spoliation of evidence.
And I have been in a hearing where a photograph suddenly appeared that we did not know it existed.
It's every attorney's worst nightmare.
Yeah, I know. It was very awkward. But it actually ended up being good for us, but it didn't matter. The fact that we had not known about it and had not turned it over beforehand, we just got beat over the head with it. Even though, like I said, it actually was good for us, and I wish we'd have had it. So, yeah, I mean, if you got this stuff, you got to turn it over, and when you don't, it is going to be used to basically say, I mean, great, that photograph was good for you. Great. What else is missing?
Right.
Like that's always the question.
So it's not easy being the defense. We're not saying that. Obviously, we're coming from the prosecution perspective, but I'm showing you how these types of questions are basically a win if you do, win if you don't sort of situation for the defense. They're great questions for the defense. You should ask these questions when you're the defense, but be alerted of what tactic they're using. Okay, so we've already talked about, Alec starts talking, pretty soon after the police come. Of course, he's the one who made the 911 call. And he also sits for an initial interview that is captured on camera. And this was played at trial. Detective Laura Rutland would testify about this initial interview given by Murdaugh on the night of the murders. Now, Laura lived in South Carolina, but then moved to England until she moved back to South Carolina. She's a true crime fan, self-avowed, and it inspired her actually to go into law enforcement. We learned her entire life story. This was kind of funny. It has nothing to do with the case, really, but the prosecutor asked an open-ended question and to tell the jury about Laura Rutland, and she just kind of comes out with her life story. Typically, as the other side, you'd probably object that it is completely irrelevant to the case, but it's to humanize her and to show that she's not in the pocket of South Carolina. She's kind of been all over the world. She's seen it all, right? She's a true crime fan. She's seen these types of cases. She's dedicated to her job. And this is not just a job, but a life passion for her.
And there's this one prosecutor who asks this question. Always, every witness, he asks it this way. And I'm always like, no, don't ask him that. Because they'll be like, well, I grew up and when I went to middle school here and high school here. And then, I played football and it was a really formative life experience. And I'm just like, oh my goodness. But Alice is right. The defense does not object to this, even though it is a completely inappropriate question.
This is partly why this trial's taking so long. It's
exactly.
Totally not relevant where their hobbies. What is relevant is their experience that directly speaks to their ability to testify about the facts of the case. So that typically doesn't happen. But, when in South Carolina, this is what's happening here. So Rutland is a liaison with the SLED agent. The case was turned over to SLED because of the potential conflicts with local law enforcement. Because, of course, Alec was, their whole family had really worked with law enforcement through the solicitor's office for generations, for 100 years. And they knew them very well, took them out to eat, brought them to baseball or sports venues and games for free, that sort of thing. Rutland's testimony talks about the conditions of the bodies, and it's incredibly graphic because it was a graphic scene. She talks about the blood and the brain matter all over the place. And during her testimony describing the bodies, Alec is in the courtroom and people do see him cry, and he cries quite often during this testimony. He covers his eyes, he sniffles, he's audibly crying. And Rutland testified that there was one set of prints going toward the bodies and one set of prints going back. They followed the footprints staying to the left side, and they followed them to where they stop at the end of the building. Rutland checked the impressions of Murdaugh's shoes and thought, based on like an eye check, that they matched the footprints. She described them as very similar. Rutland was able to say that Maggie's shoes looked like another set of shoe prints that didn't match the particular one that she was describing. Rutland and Owens then talked to Murdaugh in a police vehicle. And obviously the point about these footprints is that if there's one set, then you're talking about one person who's committing these murders because, of course, a thought is if you have two murders with two different guns, do you have more than one shooter? And her testimony is at least indicating that there's one person who is responsible.
And this is pushing back on some of the things the defense is already pointing out, which is the evidence of a possible second person, the tire tracks, the footprints, all that stuff. It's kind of funny because the trial starts off with a lot of this type of evidence, and then it kind of goes away for a while. It came back a little bit at the end of the trial, but the beginning was very much, did you see evidence of a second person on the prosecution side? And the person would say no. And then on defense, I'd come back and point out all the things they did say and that they didn't preserve. And that was sort of the thing. And then, one of the things that happened with the shoe prints we talked about a lot. Prosecution asks, did you see anything? No. Defense comes, well, what about shoe prints? Yes. Prosecution comes back on redirect and says, yeah, but they weren't really shoe prints, right? There was more just impressions in the grass. And they would say, yeah, that's right. So I don't know. I think the idea there is, even if it was a shoe print, it's not the kind of shoe print you could get any information out of, so therefore not relevant. Could have been Alec Murdaugh's, for instance. Something they're going to come back to, like we said. But the most important part of Rutland's testimony is what Alice pointed to, that police video. Obviously, Murdaugh, he's talked to that county sheriff sergeant who showed up first, but this is the recorded interview where he's sitting down and he's really laying out everything that he did that night. And Rutland is present in the police vehicle with Murdaugh when he gives his first full statement to law enforcement. In that video, he says that when he pulled up, he could see the bodies. This is actually important because, as we talked about in the timeline, 20 seconds between when he pulls up and when he calls 911. And one of the things the defense wants you to think is he pulled up, his light sort of shined on a body and he knew horrible things happened, so maybe everything's accelerated. And this is something he says. He pulls up in his car at the kennels, he can see the bodies, and he knew immediately it was bad. He starts to break down when he's talking about this, both in the video and in the courtroom as he's watching this. As Alice said, this is something that commentators have noted. There were some commentators who really moved by his emotion, as a matter of fact. And you always have to wonder, is there someone on that jury who sees him crying both in the video and in person and thinks, yeah, that's real sorrow? Granted, could be some regret for killing your family, who knows, but real sorrow. He says he could see Paul's brain when he's talking about this, obviously, which causes him some great distress. Nevertheless, he still tries to turn Paul over. Why he would do this, I don't know. But I caution you, when you're trying to apply logic to the actions of a father who just found his son murdered, as I said earlier, I don't necessarily know that that is evidence of a crime. It is convenient for him, though, because it would have gotten blood and DNA and everything else from Paul's body onto him. It is inconvenient for him because we know now there was only about 20 seconds between the finding of the bodies, or at least the pulling up of the car into that place, and the calling of 911. So by Murdaugh's own words, he's doing things that would have taken significant amount of time. He notes that as he's attempting to turn his body over, Paul's cell phone falls out of his pocket. He says that he picked up Paul's phone. This is a weird part because he kind of says he picked it up to do something with it, but he didn't end up doing anything with it, so he put it back down. And at this point, he knew Paul was dead. He leaves Paul behind. He runs over to Maggie. He says at some point that he tried to take both of their pulses. Doesn't really make sense to Paul, frankly, but nevertheless, that's what he says he did. And once again, this is actually damaging for him when we learn the information that he had to do all this in 20 seconds. At that point, once he's attempted to take their pulses and he knows he's not getting one, he calls 911. He says to the police that the 911 operator was very good, did a great job. He gets off the phone with her and he calls some family members, which is true. He absolutely did call his brothers, which is what he said. And all that is confirmed with the phone information that we get later on. The police then ask him about his day. How did this day go? He says Maggie loved the dogs. She liked to run the dogs. And so she'd gone down to the kennels and he went to check on his mom. His dad was very sick and his mom had Alzheimer's and he wanted to check on her. When he did that, he called and texted Maggie, but there was no response. Nevertheless, he went on to see his mom. When he gets back to the house, he notices there's still no one at the house. And this is confirmed by both his cell phone pings and the GM data we'll get later. When he gets back, he does go up to the main house first. At this point, he drives down to the kennels because he knows that's where Maggie was going, and he sees the aftermath of whatever happened. He's asked at this point if he saw any signs of trespassers or breaking in. It's a common question from the police trying to identify, are there any alternative suspects other than him? Once again, he is a suspect. No question about it. Even if he hadn't been there, he'd be a suspect because he's the husband. So he's going to be a suspect. The fact that he found the bodies makes him doubly a suspect. The fact that he was there immediately before it happened makes him a triple suspect. So he's definitely a suspect, but the police are trying to see, are there any other suspects? And he says the same thing he said to the earlier officer. He says the only thing that comes to mind is the boat wreck. He talks about the things that were said on Twitter, messages that were sent to Paul, threats that Paul had gotten, including in public. It wasn't just people behind a computer anonymously sending threats to Paul. There are people in public who are making threats to him. Then the weirdest thing that may have happened in this entire trial happens. He tells this incredibly strange story about the guy who had killed the sunflower seeds in his field, C.B. Rowe. Rowe was...
And Brett, you're right. Like, it comes out of nowhere. Like, he's talking about the boat wreck, and all of a sudden, I just hear, and he killed the sunflower seeds. And I'm like, what? Did we just change topics? It was so out of the blue. There was no lead up to it.
Yeah, and the sunflower seeds are dead. and this is interesting because later on, when we see Paul's text messages, he's texting with C.B. Rowe, telling him, you need to come tomorrow because we've killed the sunflowers and we need to dig them up and replant them. This entire farm is dedicated to killing various animals. I'm not sure if a certain kind of bird likes sunflowers or what the point of the sunflowers is, but they needed the sunflowers apparently to hunt something, but they had accidentally killed them, and C.B. Rowe had been the one who killed them, and he was the caretaker of the place. He had previously worked at a school in the area. He had been fired for some sort of inappropriate conduct with a student. I haven't looked into exactly what that was, and it hasn't been fleshed out in the case. It's not really all that important, other than the fact that he's now working as a caretaker. And in fact, he's working with Paul on the farm. Now, the sunflower seed thing might be important for some reason, but that's not why this story is being told. At this point, Alec tells this crazy story that apparently C.B. Rowe had told Paul. He told Paul that when he was working in high school, he'd gotten into a fight with some black guys. And this is the story that Alec's telling. He gets into a fight with some black guys, and I guess he performs exceedingly well in this fight. And he says that while he was in this fight, there were FBI undercover agents watching the fight go down. And they were so impressed by how well he fought off these black guys that they recruited him to be a member of an undercover team with 3 Navy SEALs. So it's C.B. Rowe, high school fight champion extraordinaire, and 3 Navy SEALs. And their job was to kill radical Black Panthers in the Low Country area. And they did that from Myrtle Beach all the way down to Savannah. This is the story.
And again, out of nowhere, this doesn't have to do with the sunflowers. It doesn't have to do with anything at all. It is the strangest story in the whole world. Like, and you see the officers who are like taking notes, like they're here at this devastating murder scene. And I think one of the officers is like, yeah, that's a really weird story. Like, because it is a weird story.
And here's the thing. The thing that I have learned in true crime is that if you tell a story, someone will believe it. And I kid you not, I had made some comment about the Murdaugh case, and someone on Twitter responded that they had not checked the DNA under Maggie's fingernails. And if they had, they bet it would have been C.B. Rose, because he is this trained killer, and he probably did that here. And I'm just like, oh my goodness. I mean,
just in
someone
case
will believe
y'all
anything.
are wondering, I mean, there could be like a deep, deep government strategy that Brett and I don't know about, but it is very unbelievable. The FBI is not trying to recruit people off the streets who do really well in street fights. To become a Navy SEAL is like a lifetime achievement that is incredibly difficult, and they will want you to go through the rigors of being a Navy SEAL if they're going to have you fight alongside Navy SEALs. There are not, at every like school, really you'd have them at every like playground to watch out for the next best street killer to be recruited for government psyops.
Yeah, and I can just tell you, at times in my life, I have held very high top secret security clearances and been to places that I can't really talk about. The government is way too incompetent to have ever done this. This is the silliest story that's ever been told. It didn't happen. And it's funny because the prosecution is now forced to deal with this. And if you watched as they're going through the cell phones, they're like also giving you C.B. Rose cell phone data to show that he was in another part of the state that day. So he was not involved in this murder at all. And in fact, he was off work that day and wasn't around. He had told Murdaugh that he would text him earlier about the sunflowers. Paul had texted him about sunflowers. Everybody's worried about sunflowers, but either way, he's not in the area. Now, as we said earlier when we were going through the phone calls, he is someone that Alec Murdaugh called on his way to his mother's house. And this apparently was not to talk about his life as an assassin, but instead to see when he would be able to come back to the farm to deal with this sunflower incident. Alex says that this conversation between him and C.B. Rowe about being a member of the assassination team, Paul had actually recorded that on his cell phone. Now, that has not yet been admitted into evidence. I suppose it could be part of the defense case. C.B. Rowe has not testified. I guess we'll just have to see what happens as the defense case unrolls.
I don't know what the point of telling the story was. I mean, you are like minutes, within the hour of finding your family members dead. And, he's in this initial interview, he's sitting in like the passenger seat of the car. And I think it's like a dash cam that's recording this interview. And there are, two law enforcement officers behind him, one sitting in the driver's seat. And they're all like kind of leaning in, taking notes. And it's like a very serious situation, right? They're still at the actual crime scene, just sitting in a car to like get some seating to talk about what's going on. And this is one of the stories he talks about. People don't always make sense when they are in shock, but a lot of times the useless, quote unquote, useless evidence we get in those initial interviews when someone's in shock is stuff about their family members, right? Like, oh, but Maggie loves sunflowers. And like, it usually ties back to the people who have died. It's not these like, who cares about C.B. Rowe and this like Black Panther story that he's cooked up. And so again, we don't know why he acts the way he does, but it is very strange to spend these initial hours or minutes after this tragic event to be talking about some random, wild, far-fetched story of someone who's not even that close to you.
And in his defense, he does preface the conversation by saying, this is crazy. I'm going to tell you something crazy. I mean, he does say that.
He does say that.
So, once again, if he's innocent, maybe C.B. Rowe really did tell this story and he's just trying to give them everything possible. I mean, look, if he's innocent, then he's probably in a situation where the reality is there are so many people who would want to kill him. I mean, he doesn't tell the police that, but he would know that he has screwed over a lot of people out of a lot of money, and he's involved in the drug trade because he's got apparently a $50,000 a week habit. which is impossible once again. But he would know there are a lot of people who want to kill him. Now, look, he doesn't lay that out for the cops. I mean, he doesn't say, I just want to tell you, I'm a drug addict and maybe my drug dealer would have done this. He doesn't lay any of that out. But he does mention CB Rowe. So make of it, other than what a way to start the trial. Because this was literally on day one and you're watching it and you're just like,
what is
okay,
happening?
That's new. Yeah, what is happening? This case really is as crazy because I did not follow this case until the trial. I knew about it. Everybody wanted us to cover it. I was like, yeah. Guy killed his wife and son. Big deal. Then I start watching the trial and I'm like, okay, I got to look into this more. Because that first day was wild. I mean, this is first day stuff. And hey, here we are. We took a whole episode, Alice. We got through the first day. There's only 30 more days to go.
At least thus far. This baby I'm going to birth soon might be like graduating by the time we finish this trial. I hope not.
May well be. But we're moving through it. Next week we're gonna listen to the 911 call, Alice, and we're gonna keep moving through the evidence that showed up at trial. We're gonna talk about some more guns. People always get mad at me when I talk about guns. I don't know why. It's just
they have a role in this case, that's for sure.
They do, and I'm sorry that I know about guns. Like, I'm sorry.
I'm glad you do. I clearly don't know that much, despite prosecuting them, which makes it actually kind of hard to do cross-examination. So I try to learn about the gun that I'm going to have to prosecute, like that specific gun, because there are lots of different things to know about different types of guns to better effectively cross-examine. So you just have a leg up over me. That's all.
Yeah, we get a lot of training on guns because it's important when you're handling the gun in front of the jury that it looks like you know what you're doing.
It's better not to drop the gun when handling it.
But don't drop the gun. Don't point it at anybody.
Never.
Even though it's obviously not loaded. There's so much gun theater, and you saw that in this trial, that got to make sure not to point the gun that's obviously not loaded and has a piece of plastic running through the through the barrel so it can't be shot. Anyway, that's life. Well, like I said, I feel like we're not dilly-dallying in this case.
We're
criticize
actually,
us for our
what?
stuff,
I think we're actually moving really quickly because we're afraid this baby's going to come before we finish it. So I'm proud of us, except it just shows you how much there is to talk. I don't think we've dilly-dallied at all.
Oh, no. If there was no baby, this would be a 20 episode.
I know.
We'd be doing this through July. So, yeah. Well, now that we've covered the first day, we're very interested to hear your thoughts on this. It's going to be really interesting. This episode certainly will be coming out after the verdict. So it's going to be really interesting to hear people's thoughts on the verdict and how the various evidence affected that verdict. So I'm really interested to hear that from you guys. If you're looking for more of a, I say this now when this will be weeks after the verdict happens, but I'm going to say it anyway. If you want to go back and hear our thoughts sort of live as the trial's happening and the evidence is being presented, Legal Briefs, which is our other podcast, we are doing episodes with the trial talking about this stuff, including with some really great people like Bob Mata of the Defense Diaries. He's awesome. Great to get his perspective on things. So I hope you guys are or have been listening to Defense Diaries. Another thing we're going to do, so we want to get more reviews. We're hoping to get more reviews, particularly more 5-star reviews. So 2 things I'm going to offer to you guys who are out there.
I don't know what you're about to offer, by the way.
If you leave a 5-star review and you ask a question, we will answer that question in an episode. We're going to start doing a segment where we answer questions people ask in the reviews. So leave your 5-star review, say whatever you want, but ask a question and we will answer that. That's the first thing. The second thing, as most of you know, if you're a patron, you get access to our live episodes where we talk about ongoing issues. And not only do we talk about them as they're ongoing, but our patrons are able to take part and they can ask questions and they can take part in the recording, and it's a lot of fun. If you leave a 5-star review and you send us a screenshot on either the prosecutors or the prosecutors' legal briefs, we will send you a link so you can take part in those, even if you're not a patron. So that's what I'm offering. Ask a question in a 5-star review, send us a screenshot, and you can take part in our live recordings.
Can I tell you what I thought you were going to offer? I thought you were going to offer that they could name my baby.
There you go.
And I was like, Brent, we've not talked about this.
There you go. If you can send us proof that you turned on 10 people to the podcast, you get to name Alice's baby.
And we'll actually call the baby by that name. Oh, goodness.
All right. Well, look forward to hearing your thoughts. Prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all the social media. We'll be back next week. Alice, before we sign off for today on what could be the last day before you have your baby, do you have any thoughts?
I have so many thoughts. So this baby should stay put for a little bit so we can get a couple more episodes in.
Yes, exactly. Stay pregnant, Alice. Stay pregnant. Okay, guys. Well, we'll be back next week, one way or the other, with more on the Murdaugh trial. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors.
I'm not going to send him to voicemail because then he'll know I sent him to voicemail.
Right. You know, the sending to voicemail thing, it should keep ringing. Like, that is a flaw.
I
The
know.
fact because I do the same thing. I just let it ring.
Because otherwise
I'm not gonna
they
send it
know
to
you
voicemail.
screened their call.
Exactly. Like, there should at least be an option.
Yes.
That, anyway.
Like silence or something.
Like, I can't believe they haven't figured that out.
I know.
That
I
obviously
know.
no one wants people to know that. Anyway.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. Hello.
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 Is this are we doing our singing podcast right now?
Think so. All right. You ready?
Yep.
Here we go.
All month long on Pluto TV, stream the biggest Tyler Perry movies free. Watch your favorites like Medea's Witness Protection and Medea's Big Happy Family. Join Tyler Perry as he goes on a couples retreat with Sharon Leal in Why Did I Get Married? Or Idris Elba and Gabrielle Union in the Tyler Perry directed film Daddy's Little Girls. Plus, Pluto TV has hundreds of channels with thousands more movies and TV shows. Available on live and on demand. Download the free Pluto